Right now, millions of people are essentially working a grueling full-time job that they can never, ever quit.
Yeah, it's exhausting just to think about.
I mean, I want you to think for a second about what it actually takes to manage a chronic illness like diabetes. We're talking about an endless loop of insulin injections, the constant tyranny of glucose monitors beeping in the middle of the night.
Always when you're trying to sleep, right?
Exactly, and just that lingering, heavy anxiety of potential irreversible complications. It's a reality built entirely around this concept of managing an illness rather than, actually curing it.
Right. It's what the medical community often refers to as a disease maintenance model. I mean, we've gotten incredibly sophisticated at keeping people alive with these chronic conditions.
And the pumps and everything.
Yeah, better pumps, better synthetic insulins. But the end game of all that technology is rarely a true functional resolution. You're just kind of kept in a state of suspended animation with the disease.
Okay, let's unpack this, because today we are diving into a stack of incredibly dense, ground-bracing materials, clinical trial reports, geopolitical economic analyses, and detailed policy documents that really map out a massive paradigm shift.
This is massive.
And it's happening in China right now. The mission of this deep dive is to explore how stem cell therapies are rapidly moving diabetes from a lifelong managed condition to something that can be functionally cured.
Which is huge.
Right. We're going to map out the microscopic science making this possible, but we're also going to look at the complex risks, the stark economic realities, and, well, the massive geopolitical shifts this is creating across the globe.
To really grasp the global shockwaves this is causing, we have to start at the cellular level. I mean, we are looking at a fundamental shift in how human beings approach organ failure.
Right.
When you look at the raw clinical data coming out right now, there are basically two distinct scientific paths being utilized to achieve the cellular reboot.
So before we get into those two paths, I just want to frame this. Treating diabetes with insulin is basically like constantly bailing water out of a sinking boat.
That's a great way to put it.
You're surviving, sure. You're not drowning today. But the hole in the boat is still there. You have to wake up tomorrow and bail water all over again forever.
Right, you never get to stop.
Exactly. And the stem cell therapies we're looking at in these clinical reports, they aren't just a better bucket. They're trying to actually patch the hole.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. And the specific way they patch that hole depends entirely on the type of diabetes a patient has. Let's look at Path 1, which targets type 1 diabetes and severe end-stage type 2.
Okay.
This is the realm of iPSCs, or induced pluripotent stem cells.
Right. And the breakthrough here, specifically driven by Chinese scientists like the team at Peking University, is something called CiPSCs. The C stands for chemical. They're basically using chemical reprogramming to turn back the biological clock of a cell.
Yeah, and historically, turning a mature adult cell back into a stem cell was an incredibly dangerous process. I mean, it required viral vectors.
Viruses.
Literally using a modified virus to insert new genes into the cell's DNA. But that carried a massive risk of genetic mutation. The Chinese teams, they figured out how to bypass the viruses entirely.
Wow.
They take a patient's own fat cells, usually extracted from the abdomen through a minor procedure, and they bathe those cells in a highly specific cocktail of small molecule chemical drugs.
It essentially wipes the cellular hard drive clean.
That is a great analogy. It completely erases the cell's identity as a fat cell. It safely reverses their biological clock, returning them to a pluripotent state.
And pluripotent just means they can become anything, right?
Exactly. It means they have the potential to become almost any cell type in the human body. Then scientists take these blank slate cells and place them in a highly controlled bioreactor.
Like an incubator.
Right, an environment that perfectly mimics the chemical signals of a developing human pancreas. Over several weeks, they coax these cells to grow into fully functional, glucose-sensing islet cells.
So they're literally building a brand new biological insulin factory from the patient's own fat.
Basically, yeah.
But that's only Path 1. Path 2 focuses on the vast majority of diabetic patients worldwide, those with type 2 diabetes. And for this, the clinical reports detail the use of MSCs, or mesenchymal stem cells.
Right, because for type 2 diabetes, the fundamental issue isn't always a complete lack of insulin-producing cells.
Right, it's the resistance.
Exactly, it's severe systemic insulin resistance. The pancreas might still be pumping out insulin, but the body's cells have just stopped responding to the signal. So putting in new islet cells wouldn't actually solve the core problem.
Ah, I see.
MSCs act entirely differently. They act less like replacement parts and more like system microenvironment engineers.
Microenvironment engineers. Okay, so they aren't turning into new beta cells to produce insulin. What are they actually doing when they get infused into the patient?
Well, when these MSCs, which can be sourced from, umbilical cords, bone marrow, or even fat tissue, when they're introduced into the bloodstream, they secrete massive amounts of two vital things: exosomes and cytokines.
Okay, break those down for me.
Think of exosomes as microscopic care packages filled with healing proteins and genetic instructions. And cytokines act like chemical messengers that explicitly tell the body's overactive immune system to stand down and stop chronic inflammation.
So they're actively changing the chemical environment of the body?
Aggressively so. They dial down systemic chronic inflammation, which is the root cause of the insulin resistance in the first place.
Wow.
They actually alter the molecular receptors on the patient's cells so the body becomes sensitive to its own insulin again. And the clinical data shows they secrete factors that stop the remaining native pancreatic cells from dying off while promoting massive widespread tissue repair.
And that tissue repair is so potent that the medical documents show it being used to heal severe diabetic foot ulcers.
Oh, absolutely.
We're talking about necrotic wounds that traditionally lead straight to lower limb amputations, but the MSCs literally migrate to the site of the wound, trigger the growth of new blood vessels, and rebuild the destroyed tissue from the inside out.
It is a systemic reboot.
Yeah.
But, going back to the iPSCs, the direct replacement strategy where they build new islet cells, there is a highly specific surgical innovation detailed in the clinical reports that radically alters the safety profile of this whole procedure.
Oh, I know what you're talking
It
about.
all comes down to the implantation site.
Yeah, I was reading the surgical protocols in the stack, and this part just stopped me in my tracks.
Right.
Traditionally, if doctors were doing an islet cell transplant, like the famous Edmonton protocol developed in Canada decades ago, they inject the donor cells directly into the liver via the portal vein.
Exactly.
But the Chinese surgical teams are implanting these reprogrammed stem cells into the anterior rectus sheath of the abdomen. Basically, they're sliding them right under the abdominal muscles.
Yep.
Wait, why the abs? That sounds completely random.
It sounds random until you look at the vascular architecture of the human body. The liver is actually a tremendously hostile environment for new cells.
Really?
Yeah, it is a high coagulation environment. When you inject delicate new islet cells into the liver, it triggers something called an instant blood-mediated inflammatory reaction, or IBMR.
That sounds intense.
It is.
Yeah.
Essentially, the liver's natural defense mechanisms attack the foreign introduction, and you lose a huge percentage of your transplanted cells almost immediately to this hostile immune and clotting response.
So the liver just suffocates and shreds the cure before it can even set up shop.
Exactly. But the anterior rectus sheath in the abdomen has a phenomenally rich, yet much calmer, capillary network.
Ah, so it's a better neighborhood for the cells.
Much better. This allows the newly implanted stem cells to achieve rapid vascularization. They hook into the blood supply almost instantly, getting the oxygen and nutrients they need to survive those crucial first few days.
Makes sense.
Second, it's a relatively isolated, superficial anatomical space. This makes it very easy for doctors to monitor the graft's health with just a simple, non-invasive ultrasound. And third, and most crucially, it provides a safe exit strategy.
Because if something goes wrong, you can't just easily cut out a piece of someone's liver.
Exactly. If there's an adverse reaction, or if the cells begin to proliferate in an unpredictable way, a surgeon can go in with a minimally invasive, localized procedure and completely remove the graft from the abdominal wall.
Wow.
It massively elevates the safety boundary of the entire therapy, giving doctors a physical undo button that simply does not exist with liver implants.
I mean, the biological theory here is undeniably brilliant. But a leaky boat isn't fixed until it actually floats in the water.
True.
And the clinical reports don't just give us lab theory, they give us the human proof.
Right. The clinical translations that occurred between 2024 and 2026 are really what forced the global medical community to pay attention.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I just want to walk you through the monumental case from late 2024, early 2025. We have a 25-year-old Chinese woman. She had a decade-long history of severe type 1 diabetes.
Very severe case.
Her native beta cells were completely destroyed by her own immune system. She was at constant risk of fatal hypoglycemic comas, like her blood sugar would just randomly drop to lethal levels.
Terrifying.
So the medical team extracts her fat cells, uses that chemical reprogramming we talked about, turns them into new islet cells, and implants them into her abdomen.
And the results.
In just 75 days, she was completely off exogenous insulin, a functional cure. Her blood sugar stabilized entirely on its own.
That is just incredible.
Imagine that for a second. Imagine the psychological freedom of waking up for the first time in a decade, knowing your body is autonomously regulating itself again. No needles, no alarms.
To understand the magnitude of that specific achievement, we really have to compare it to what was happening in Western medicine simultaneously.
Okay, let's do that.
The documents highlight the US-based Vertex Pharmaceuticals trial, known as VX-880. Vertex also successfully restored insulin production in their trial patients, which is an incredible scientific milestone in its own right.
Right.
But Vertex used embryonic stem cells derived from an external donor.
Meaning the patient's immune system immediately recognizes those cells as foreign invaders and tries to kill them.
Exactly. So the Vertex patients have to take highly toxic, lifelong immunosuppressant drugs just so their bodies don't reject the cure.
Oh, wow.
We're talking about heavy-duty anti-rejection medications that carry severe, long-term risks of kidney toxicity, systemic infections, and even secondary cancers.
That's a huge trade-off.
But because the Chinese trial used the 25-year-old woman's own reprogrammed fat cells, it completely bypassed the nightmare of organ rejection. Her immune system recognized the new insulin factory as self. No toxic anti-rejection meds were needed.
And it wasn't just type 1. Fast forward to February 2026, a 59-year-old man with a 25-year history of severe type 2 diabetes.
Another landmark case?
He had end-stage complications, he was on massive daily doses of insulin, plus a heavy cocktail of oral medications just to stay alive. They gave him a highly customized stem cell treatment. In 11 weeks, he was off all insulin. Eventually, he stopped the oral meds too.
Which proves that even a highly degraded end-stage metabolic system, one that has been failing for a quarter of a century, can be fundamentally rebooted.
Yeah.
We are shifting from simply delaying an inevitable decline to actively restoring natural organ function.
I just have to pause on that for a second. 25 years of severe diabetes, he was at the end of the line, and in 11 weeks, he's just done with insulin.
It's hard to overstate.
As someone who has watched family members struggle with this disease, it sounds like an absolute miracle. But I know you're looking at the clinical data, not miracles. Where's the catch?
Well, this raises an important question. What are the physical boundaries of this science, and what are the clinical risks? We must approach this with scientific restraint, and the trial reports are very clear about the hurdles.
Okay, what are they?
First is the issue of durability. The success stories we just discussed have follow-up periods of 1 to 3 years.
Which is incredible, but it's not a lifetime.
Exactly. We simply do not know the functional decay curve of these lab-engineered cells inside the complex human body over a decade or two.
Right.
Will these cells exhaust themselves in 5 or 10 years, requiring patients to undergo secondary booster transplants? We just don't have the longitudinal data yet to answer that. Second is the risk of oncogenicity.
The cancer risk.
Specifically, the risk of teratomas. Because pluripotent stem cells have the power to become absolutely any cell in the human body, they are inherently volatile.
That makes sense.
If even a microscopic fraction of undifferentiated cells that haven't fully committed to becoming islet cells accidentally make it into the final implant, they don't know what to be. So they could theoretically grow infinitely and form highly dangerous tumors composed of random tissue types. The chemical purification processes in these labs are incredibly strict to prevent this, but it remains a primary fear for regulatory bodies worldwide. And third is the sheer economic friction of the process itself.
Cost.
Custom growing a bespoke batch of autologous stem cells for months in a highly controlled lab is immensely labor-intensive. It is not currently something that can be mass-produced on a standardized assembly line.
Which makes it incredibly expensive. But I want to push back on something regarding the type 1 patients specifically. Hold on. If type 1 is fundamentally an autoimmune disease, it means the body's immune system is explicitly programmed to hunt down and kill insulin-producing beta cells.
That's correct.
So taking fat, turning it into new beta cells, and putting it back in doesn't fix the underlying immune system glitch. Isn't that like putting a brand new engine into a car where the car's computer is still explicitly programmed to destroy the engine?
That is an exceptionally accurate analogy. The autoimmune memory is arguably the fatal flaw in treating type 1 diabetes, even with a patient's own autologous cells. The patient's body won't reject the cells as foreign, but their existing autoantibodies, the ones that cause the diabetes in the first place, might eventually recognize them as beta cells and attack them all over again once the initial honeymoon period of the transplant ends.
So how do you stop the new engine from being destroyed by the car's own computer?
This naturally leads us to the cutting edge of current regenerative research, which is encapsulation technology.
Encapsulation.
Scientists are developing biological, semi-permeable membranes to physically shield the implant. Think of it as putting a microscopic, bulletproof vest on the stem cells.
But the vest still has to let the insulin out, right? I mean, that's the whole point.
Right. And that is the engineering nightmare. The physical geometry of the problem is staggering. The pores in this vest must be perfectly sized.
How small are we talking?
They have to be large enough to let tiny glucose molecules flow in and small insulin molecules flow out. But those exact same pores must be too small for the massive immune cells and destructive Y-shaped antibodies to penetrate.
Oh, that sounds impossible.
Engineering a biocompatible material to achieve that exact molecular sieve without triggering scar tissue that chokes off the oxygen supply adds a massive layer of complexity and potential failure points to the therapy.
Okay, but a regulatory shortcut or a brilliant scientific breakthrough doesn't mean anything if it's trapped in a lab for the next 20 years.
Very true.
I was looking at the economic and policy analyses in our stack, and the way this is actually reaching patients right now is fascinating. So what does this all mean for someone who needs this treatment today?
Well, the answer isn't another scientific breakthrough. It's actually a profound regulatory hack. To understand how patients are accessing this today, we have to look at the Boao Lecheng International Medical Tourism Pilot Zone in China's Hainan province.
It's a special medical zone carved out geographically and legally, right?
Exactly. The central government gave this specific zone unprecedented policy exemptions. And the absolute regulatory genius of Boao Lecheng was redefining what a stem cell is in the eyes of the law.
Wait, how do you redefine a cell?
Usually, regulatory bodies like the FDA in the United States or the European Medicines Agency look at a stem cell therapy and categorize it as a pharmaceutical drug.
Okay.
And drugs require 10 to 15 years of phase 1, 2, and 3 randomized, double-blind clinical trials, costing hundreds of millions of dollars before a single civilian can buy it.
But inside the Lecheng zone, the Chinese regulatory authorities officially classified specific, safety-verified autologous stem cell therapies not as pharmaceuticals, but as medical technologies.
Precisely.
That distinction completely changes the entire timeline of human access.
It really does. If a top-tier, specially licensed hospital inside the zone passes strict safety, ethics, and pricing audits, they can legally offer these therapies commercially to patients who meet the strict clinical criteria right now.
Right now.
They do not have to wait a decade for a pharmaceutical designation.
Which brings us to the actual economics of this. If we look at the official 2025 pricing directories detailed in our sources, we get some hard numbers. For a standard package, say, targeting type 2 diabetes with MSCs, the base cost runs between $12,000 to $18,000.
And for highly complex end-stage cases requiring deep custom cellular engineering, like the bespoke iPSC treatments, that package can climb to $20,000 and in extreme cases, all the way up to $110,000.
To the average listener, $110,000 sounds absolutely astronomical. It sounds like healthcare only for billionaires.
It is a massive upfront cost, there's no denying that. But the economic reports urge us to look at the comparative global economics and reframe how we view the cost of chronic disease.
How so?
That $12,000 to $18,000 base package is actually 50% to 70% cheaper than comparable, albeit less advanced, regenerative therapies currently attempting to enter the U.S. market.
Wow, okay.
More importantly, we have to weigh the capital investment against the lifetime subscription of American healthcare.
Right, because a severe diabetic in the West will easily spend hundreds of thousands of dollars over a 30-year period. You're paying for continuous glucose monitors, thousands of vials of novel synthetic insulins, emergency room visits for unexpected hypoglycemia, and eventually the staggering costs of dialysis or amputation surgeries.
The stem cell therapy, while requiring a painful upfront cash payment, is essentially a one-time capital investment to buy out decades of future physical suffering and medical attrition.
And the policy documents also outline a really stark contrast in how different governments view the risk of bringing this to market. On one side, you have the US FDA, which the economic analyses describe as prioritizing programmatic correctness, sticking to rigid, decades-long double-blind trials to eliminate even the most microscopic theoretical risks before public release.
Right.
On the other side, the documents highlight China's pragmatic approach in Hainan. Obviously, we're just reporting what the sources say here, not taking a side.
Absolutely. The mechanism driving that pragmatism is RWD, or real-world data. China is allowing these therapies to be applied in the real world inside this highly monitored zone, and then aggressively harvesting the clinical data, the efficacy, the long-term safety profiles from those actual patient outcomes.
They're learning as they go.
They are using this massive influx of real-world evidence to iteratively improve the science, bypassing the traditional, slow-moving trial structures. The analyses suggest this allows life-saving tech to reach desperate patients exponentially faster, though it relies on a very different regulatory risk tolerance model than Western agencies operate under.
And we are simply reporting what the economic and policy analyses are outlining here regarding global market dynamics, but it leads to a very practical problem for the listener.
It does.
The cure exists, the special medical zone exists, the regulations allow it. But if you listening right now wanted to access this, you can't just hop on a travel website, book a flight to Hainan, and walk into a clinic with your credit card.
No, definitely not. The gap between a foreign patient and this highly regulated medical oasis is filled with extreme logistical and medical danger.
We really have to talk about the dark side of this boom, the gray market. Because wherever there is legitimate cutting-edge science, there are grifters.
Unfortunately, yes.
The reports explicitly warn about a massive lower-tier medical market unregulated beauty clinics and private, uncredentialed doctors pushing fake anti-aging stem cells. They prey on desperate medical tourists who don't know how to navigate the system, charging exorbitant fees for unregulated cell injections that could cause severe bloodborne infections or worse.
Navigating that jungle requires a highly specialized logistical bridge. This introduces the vital role of medical concierge services. The analyses highlight MedBridge NZ as the prime example of how this cross-border medical migration is managed safely.
But to be very clear, MedBridge NZ does not provide medical care. They are not doctors.
Exactly. They are strictly a logistics, legal, and risk control layer. Their core value is acting as a firewall against medical fraud.
How do they do that?
They ensure international patients only cross the threshold of legally approved hospitals that are JCI accredited, meaning they meet the Joint Commission International's gold standard for global hospital safety and are strictly licensed by the NMPA, which is China's National Medical Products Administration. It's basically their equivalent of the FDA.
MedBridge NZ also handles the sheer bureaucratic nightmare of international medicine. The documents note that through the special zone's privileges, these concierge teams can secure rapid approvals for imported therapies in just 3 to 7 days.
Which is incredibly fast.
Yeah. They organize MDTs, multidisciplinary teams, so your local doctors back home can coordinate directly with the top specialists in China before you even board a plane. And perhaps most importantly, they provide elite medical translation.
That's crucial.
Because if you're legally consenting to a highly experimental cellular implant, you cannot rely on an app on your phone to understand the clinical risks.
No, you absolutely cannot. And this raises an important question. If we connect this to the bigger picture, what the economic reports argue we are witnessing is a fundamental reversal of global medical gravity.
Reversal of gravity.
For decades, the flow of medical migration was strictly east to west. Wealthy individuals from Asia or the Middle East would fly to specialized clinics in the US or Europe for advanced care.
Right, like the Mayo Clinic. But because of the West's regulatory bottlenecks regarding live cell therapies, that wealth and migration is shifting east.
Exactly. The geopolitical wealth transfer is significant. But there's an even larger economic implication detailed in these reports.
Let's hear it.
The analyses argue that this one-and-done cure model poses a direct existential threat to the Western pharmaceutical financial empire.
The disease maintenance model we talked about at the beginning, if you can actually functionally cure a patient in a matter of weeks using their own reprogrammed cells, that patient no longer needs to buy a lifetime subscription to insulin. They don't need proprietary monitoring devices, and they don't need lifelong prescriptions to blockbuster GLP-1 agonists, those massive weight loss and diabetes drugs that require continuous use to maintain results.
Again, we are impartially outlining the market models presented in the texts, but the economic implication is starkly presented. If Western pharmaceutical giants do not pivot rapidly from chemical synthesis to genomic and cellular cures, they risk massive market erosion in the face of these regenerative breakthroughs.
It's a total rewriting of the rules of human health. We've covered an incredible amount of ground today. From the microscopic genius of chemical reprogramming to wipe a cell's hard drive clean, to the microenvironment engineering of MSCs dialing down systemic inflammation.
It's been a deep dive for sure.
We've looked at the real human triumphs, the 25-year-old woman and the 59-year-old man who reclaimed their biological autonomy in 2024 and 2026. We've navigated the regulatory oasis of Hainan, the stark package economics versus lifelong American healthcare costs, and the absolute necessity of logistical bridges like MedBridge NZ to safely access it all without falling victim to the gray market.
It's a testament to how rapidly the landscape of medicine is evolving. What was considered science fiction just a decade ago is now a legally categorized, commercially priced medical technology.
As you process all this, thinking about how this shifts the future of global medicine, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over, something that builds on everything we've discussed today.
Well, this should be good.
If we are now fully capable of extracting human cells, chemically reprogramming their biological clocks to a blank slate, and using them to completely regenerate a failed metabolic system, what happens when this exact same technology is aimed at aging itself? If we stop viewing aging as an inevitable, irreversible decline, and start treating it simply as a reversible cellular error, just like we are learning to do with diabetes, how does that fundamentally change the timeline of your own life?
It changes the definition of a lifespan entirely.
It really does, because maybe, just maybe, we're finally learning how to permanently patch the hole in the boat instead of just handing the next generation a bigger bucket.